feeling the energy of everyone in the room. It's really hard to, as someone who works with the body and embodied practice, to know that you're out there and I'm actually looking at myself instead of looking at all of you. So I'm gonna look into this black circle and imagine all of your beloved faces and bodies in the space, feeling your heartbeats and moving forward with what is a really massive topic and something that I think is super familiar to all of us. And that's how we can cultivate mental wellness for ourselves, for our loved ones, and for our communities. This is like an arts-informed approach to that topic. And so it's, in that sense, it's very experimental. And I really invite whatever feedback I can receive on this Zoom. So we'll have the chat open. I'm gonna try to glance over at it as we're working, and really invite you to share what's on your heart. I'm also feeling vulnerable and a bit nervous because this is my first time doing this kind of thing without seeing the full grid of faces on Zoom. So really appreciating all of your presence and some of the names of folks that I know in the chat. The one piece I wanted to bring just a little bit about myself, in addition to what was already shared, is that I come to this work as someone who grew up hearing the stories of people who were incarcerated in my family, my elders, the grandparent generation of my family. Many of them survived the Holocaust against Jewish people in Eastern Europe, and I always had a sense of the injustice of incarceration. And when I was a teenager, I attended some of the rallies in Kingston. At that time, there had been a riot at the prison for women, and that really shaped, those two experiences really shaped my understanding of the injustices of incarceration. I carry a lot of privilege as a white person who whose family and history of violence in my immediate life managed to avoid incarceration. And it's really an honor to provide spiritual care on the inside. And I do try to leverage my privilege as much as possible. We're working with principles of reciprocity and mutual aid, mutual care, mutual support in this framework of community abolition, which is a massive topic. And its beauty is perhaps in all the different ways it shows up in our lives. Today, I'm going to focus on really what it means to show up for ourselves in our community with the best ground we have possible, and how we might intersect with some scenarios in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities that deal with folks who are in mental health crisis. So we'll move from kind of the self out to community. I'm very interested in the ways that our social movements can hold space for all kinds of mental states. And I love this quote from Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. We seek to build movements that not only end violence, but that create a society based on radical freedom, mutual accountability, and passionate reciprocity. In this society, safety and security will not be premised on violence or the threat of violence. It will be based on a collective commitment to guaranteeing the survival and care of all people. So as you continue to build in the chat and maybe reflect more on that quote, if you're into it, I'm gonna play just a little section, considering time, of a really wonderful grounding exercise. I'm sure lots of folks on this in this webinar are familiar with generative somatics. This is a very specific kind of somatic work in which we bring in all of our histories, all of our identities, our ancestors, the ways in which we connect with the earth, all as resources to support us in our mental health. And one of the most amazing generative somatics practitioners is named Prentice Hemphill. They're based out of North Carolina. And I wanted to share just a little bit of a really beautiful grounding exercise that they do. So it's actually part of a larger webinar on somatics, healing, and social justice in the time of coronavirus. And I'm going to play about 5 minutes of it so we can get into our bodies and get into this mode together.
Kind of get into the practice. First, going to just kind of drop into our feeling selves. And just take a moment to let your breath start to allow you to be as you are. So whatever you might be noticing as you start to turn inwards, we're just going to make space for that to be so. Nothing here to change or fix. Good. And we're going to center intentionally, and part of this is about how do we re-inhabit ourselves, our bodies, and kind of occupy the places in ourselves that trauma, oppression, the pressures of our day might ask us to change, shift, be smaller, bigger. We're going to fill into ourselves through this practice and be as we are. And we're going to do that through the resource of center. So I'm going to have you feel for that place inside of yourself. You can kind of perceive it outwardly if you want to put a hand about 2 inches below your belly button. And this practice can be done seated, standing, lying down. Really just want to find a place where your body can settle, but also be alert. Allow your attention and your breath to drop into that space. You might even sometimes, I imagine, what's the centermost point in my side of my center? Can I radiate out from there to the edges of my skin? Good, bring your breath, your attention there. And then we're going to practice intentionally centering in the dimension of length. So however your body is positioned, just going to invite a lengthening in your spine. A lengthening in the back of your neck. Letting your chin level. Good, and also simultaneously rooting downward. So imagine your pelvis gets to drop, imagining the length, feeling for the length of your legs. What really is the distance between your pelvis and your knees and your ankles. And if it's your feet or your butt, can you sense for the ground underneath you? And your kind of rootedness and connection along this vertical line. So both the ground below, sky above. And in somatics, we talk about this dimension as a place where we might express dignity. And the place where we might also invite, perceive dignity in other folks.
So just breathing into that reality, the lengthening and the dignity. I'll post that into the chat when we're done our section, so you can experience that entirety, which is extremely centering, grounding, especially for the work we all do. And I'm gonna move now to conversation around how we might notice our own needs and our own mental wellness. And doing this, acknowledging that this is our ground, this is our starting point, and that it is so worthwhile to resource ourselves and to spend as much time and as much attention as is required each and every day to show up for ourselves as we are, whatever that looks like. And so I'm going to use a strategy that I'm calling webs. I'm going to invite you through my session to make 4 different webs. And I'm imagining them on kind of a post-it style note or a bigger piece of paper, but thinking about an expansiveness instead of a list, even though I'm starting here with a list. So the first web I want you to make is called My Mental Wellness. Hope you can see that. Just gonna give myself a moment. Oh yeah, you could definitely see that. And your mental wellness is gonna be your own thing. It's gonna have a lot of shared aspects. And if you could put it inside of a web, kind of like this, a chart of any kind, or you can use shapes or even string. And just writing out or feeling out the main components that allow you to feel grounded and centered. So the list I started here: freedom of movement, freedom of bodies, freedom of being, consent to relationship, medication and treatment, a co-created treatment plan, all health needs being met, not siloing mental, physical, emotional, spiritual dimensions, connection to ancestors, connection to culture, land, elements, and practices that resource and sustain us indefinitely, connection to ourselves in our multiple identities, in our genders, in our bodies as they are. So good. I'm going to give a few minutes, just like we did before, for you to do your own writing. If you feel like sharing in the chat, we'd love to see what you're adding to this list. And if we can imagine ourselves creating a collective web of mental wellness that we'll keep building on, we'll keep growing. This is part of how we keep each other safe. Opportunity for rest. The urgency of leaving carceral thinking and the embodiedness of that, the embodied carceral space. Spiritual healing. Authentic support. Self-compassion, self-care. Freedom from pathologization of justified human emotions, experiences, and action. Slowing down, nourishment, trust in others and trust in self, healthy food and time to cook, children as part of workspaces, connection to others, community, prayer, sense of purpose, movement, access to art. So many amazing pieces to the puzzle of mental wellness. And we're going to move to something we're all very familiar with, which is how incarceration affects mental wellness. And this is something we all know. The nature of incarceration is extremely violent and detrimental to mental health, to spiritual health, to emotional health. So it makes whatever state we might be in worse. And the process of our injustice system puts people in a space where they're constantly hypervigilant, where they have to be in protection mode in whatever that looks like for them, 24 hours a day, including when they're sleeping. If folks have had a treatment or a support network that worked for them, that's definitely reduced, often destroyed by the experience of being incarcerated. And there's usually some form of isolation, whether it be physical, social, emotional, spiritual, even isolation from oneself, being outside of the comfort of their lived spaces, whatever safety. That's going to be absolutely decimated by the experience of incarceration. Being incarcerated also reduces options for medication, treatment programs, and health practitioners. Many of us who struggle with our mental wellness have spent years honing a community of practitioners that we trust, and those are people we can never get access to on the inside. You have to kind of put up with a very specific kind of mental health care that doesn't work for a lot of folks, and a system that's way too under-resourced to deal with the lack of mental wellness on the inside. The nature of our colonial prison system is such that pathologization is how people enter the system. So people are seen in categories and boxes. They go through assessments, they have to fill out forms, statements and labels are put on them. And whatever they experience of their own mental wellness is further limited by their own lack of agency and care. And even the act of reaching out on the inside can negatively affect us. Prisoners can lose privileges. They can be transferred to different institutions. They can be sent to different ranges or units. And of course, despite legislation, many prisons still treat trans and non-binary prisons by pathologizing their gender expression. So these are just a few of the ways the experience of incarceration does huge amounts of damage to mental wellness. And we could have an entire webinar on this topic, and many of you who are in this webinar understand this profoundly. So as we build our own web of mental wellness, we're also calling in folks on the inside tonight, people who are feeling this isolation and for whom that energetic support is so deeply appreciated. So when we think about that carceral framework and what we're imagining and what many of us are already building, this non-carceral mental health support, that looks like something that's super personalized for us and changes over time as we need it. It's self-directed, it's consent-based. It comes from a deep understanding of trauma and its effects on thinking, on emotions, on spirit. It's informed by identity and the fantastic, phenomenal wisdom of Black and Indigenous communities, of elders. It's also technology friendly, like we're doing tonight, experimenting, being with what is when we can't be in space together, and all the amazing creativity that goes into designing technologies to assist us when we need that kind of support. It's rooted in a shared lived experience of our mental wellness coming in and out of helping us and sometimes causing us harm. We're never one thing, and whatever is present for us is okay. It's also about long-term building of relationships with ourselves, with our histories, with our past, with our loved ones, with our benevolent and not so benevolent community and family. And it's about giving ourselves permission to be flexible and experiment. Sometimes failing, sometimes flailing, sometimes having amazing success. And this journey can be very quiet and internal for many of us. And it's also about when we're working with others to receive the questions that we need so that we can get to an answer that helps build ground and foundation. We're the experts in our own care, and we can learn over time that centering ourselves is the best way to also assist others, loved ones in our community, in our family. And the final thing on this list that I've done is that non-carceral mental health support is offered very much from a place of caring for our own capacities and sustainability. And if we don't have a huge capacity to help and offer emotional and spiritual support to others in that moment, that's perfectly okay. And we can take a step back, knowing we're in a space of abundance and not lack. So I'm inviting a second post-it, a second web that's called My Non-Carceral Mental Health Support. What does it look like for you? Get out some colors this time and use them to sort of lean into the real sense of freedom that you can achieve for yourself internally when you're truly supported by your loved ones, by community. And so we're going to move now into thinking more broadly about some possible interventions. All of us, multiple times a day, intersect with folks who are struggling. And in the most scary circumstances, it's really hard to know what to do. But this is such a critical question when we talk about abolishing police and coming up with community strategies that really support mental wellness. So I'm going to quickly move through a few examples that I just think are so incredible and can really trigger our creative juices when we think about what we want to build here in Toronto. Concern is an app that was created in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco. Essentially, it's based on the idea of identifying when somebody's in need of support or having a health crisis and using a non-carceral reporting mechanism so that a compassionate responder, which is a team of trained folks who are grassroots, totally uninvolved in the carceral system, can come immediately in the same way that we imagine police are supposed to come immediately. And they arrive to mediate or provide whatever assistance is necessary and offer resources. And I'll be sharing the link to this at the end of the presentation. The Oakland Power Projects have a really similar system, and they give out tips, they train people on how to make a decision other than calling 911. And these are some of the critical questions they invite folks to ask. And Creative Interventions, which is this amazing coalition by lots of people from Critical Resistance and other organizations, has a massive workbook, a training that they do across Turtle Island to help people figure out safety plans and actions when they're in the face of helping folks who are in major mental health crises. And again, I invite you to reflect on these worksheets, make your own version of them, and I'll post the link at the end of the presentation. So when we talk about safety, the first and primary way to approach anyone is in a grounded way. And that means our own safety is taken care of. So when we're presented with a situation in which we might step up to help, there's some critical questions we can ask ourselves, and I've listed those here. And then there's kind of a general toolbox of safety things that we might need that would be individual to each of us. And that's going to be our third web, my safety. So just taking a few minutes to jot down using color, using black and white, what you need to feel like calm in your body. Some folks know that as your green zone. If you're talking about your window of tolerance, what makes you feel safe? Because one of the most important things to acknowledge is that assisting someone in crisis does increase your risk of being unsafe. And that's just part of the offering, part of the service. So making a web now of your own safety, what you need, maybe reflecting on some times when you've done interventions that felt really good or didn't feel as safe for you. So what do I know about the situation? What information do I need to make good decisions? Who, how many, or what people and institutions are already involved in the situation? Who currently has the most decision-making power? Who has the least? What are the possible harms that are present? Are there babies, toddlers, children, or youth involved? Are there elders or seniors involved? Which social locations or identities are present and which are the most impacted? What might I not know or understand or be attuned to in this realm? What could occur that would increase harm? And what are the safety resources that are immediately present in this moment for me and for others? And then I'm going to flow into the next question, just noticing the time, which is your fourth web around your own capacity. So again, all of us have experiences of jumping in to help and to serve and to witness and to observe. And the question of our own resources is just so critical in how we can do that in a sustained way. So I'm inviting you now to flow into a fourth web that really addresses capacity, and specifically how it might show up in a situation of crisis. So asking yourself, am I prepared and able to manage this situation if there's violence or if the violence escalates? How might my relationships to those involved change if I participate? And am I willing to accept that change? What backup do I need? Who are my immediate resources? Can I distinguish between what would feel unsafe for me and what would feel uncomfortable? What is my bottom line for disengagement? At what point do I just need to stop to keep myself safe and sane? Have I grounded myself and let someone I trust know that I'm involved? And which aspects of my identity might increase danger for myself? Which aspects of my identity might increase my resilience, insight, and awareness? So this fourth web, the web of your capacity, I'm imagining as something that can really shift and would be very situation specific. And with that, I'm imagining us moving into a couple scenarios. And I think I'm actually just going to offer one scenario in the interest of time, and we can circle back with another if time permits. Just going to invite us to take a deep breath. Thank you for your message, Naty, acknowledging that. And move now into a space where you're really looking at your whole web. The 4 webs, since they intersect and interact with each other. Maybe they want some additional decoration or lines drawn, processes that help you bring everything together. And maybe there's 1 or 2 things you want to put a circle around because you're realizing that's the next step in your learning. One of the amazing benefits and blessings I experienced from being in this movement for transformative justice is that we're constantly learning and growing and changing and supporting each other in all of that learning and growth. So wherever you are on your path, maybe circling a couple things going, yeah, that's the direction I'm going in next. I really wanted to share before offering some scenarios to reflect on a reading about the difference between sympathy and empathy. So I know for myself, one of the things I've struggled with most is understanding how to resource myself over and over again when I feel like I'm depleting my well. And that idea of relating to people as we move towards them, as we listen, and I don't just mean listening with our ears with language, I mean listening through our bodies, through energetic dimension, through vibration. That process can be depleting if we don't replenish our well. And this difference between sympathy and empathy really hit home for me when I read it. It's by Margaret Cornfield, who wrote a book called Cultivating Wholeness, which is about counseling and care in spiritual community. When you listen sympathetically, you're using your sense of being similar to the person you're with. You have a shared emotion, you feel with them. Etymologically, sympathy means feeling for. When you feel yourself responding with sympathy, you need to ask, in what ways is this story like mine, and how are we different? A rule that I like to follow is to only tell our own story about an event in our lives to people after we have worked through that event enough to feel little conflict about it. That's how we can work with being triggered. You might not be totally over it, but you have less conflict than when the event happened to you. You don't have to speak about your similar experiences to use them for understanding. And that sympathy will be experienced as a finely tuned emotional response. Even when we're sharing a feeling of loss or pain, we're being moved by a familiar place in ourselves, and we can meet another in that similar point. Our experience of empathy, on the other hand, can sometimes make us feel uncomfortable and even unsafe because it always requires us to journey into the unknown. When we empathize, we first have to acknowledge how we are different from the person that we're talking to or feeling into with. Empathy means feeling into, and it's a different level, a deeper layer to know them in their uniqueness. It's also a paradox because in order to make contact with another, we have to acknowledge how singular, unique, and alone we all are. And truly meeting someone in their deepest isolation and grieving can be a profoundly moving experience that destabilizes us. Yet it is when we accept our uniqueness and do not assume that we know the other's experience that we can be truly open to their aloneness and meet them there. So it's about being uncomfortable about not knowing and cultivating a friendly attitude towards the experience of not understanding. And if we work with slowness and slowly form impressions, we know much more about the other than we're consciously aware of. So I hope that's helpful in terms of how we move towards someone in a scenario where we're witnessing crisis. Thank you for your chat comments. It helps me get a sense of where people are at. Yeah, I really do appreciate this book, and I'll post in the chat the full title and author. So I'm gonna take about 10 minutes to go through some scenarios. What I think I'm gonna do is read 3 different ones and invite you to pick which one you wanna reflect on. It's gonna be a bit of a longer writing exercise. It's gonna be about 5 minutes, and there's some questions to respond to. So I'll share my screen again. And this is a quote from this same book. Although we use our minds to understand the meaning our counselees make of their experience, we first make contact with them through our emotional responses. So this is a scenario that's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to many of us. You're moving down the street in your neighborhood with a friend, having a social distancing walk together. It's night, it's about 9 p.m., it's dark out, and you notice someone yelling behind you and turn around. Someone who seems to be alone is walking quickly and yelling to no one you can see. They don't have shoes on and are coming towards you. So the questions are all the same. I'll read them at the end. But if that scenario feels like something you resonate with and want to explore a bit, choose that one. Here's the second one. You are at an abolition rally and a demonstration which has just ended. It was outside 55 Division. About 2,000 people had attended, and the passionate words of the speakers left you feeling very emotional. The people you were with have left, and the organizers are gone. As you gather your things to go, you notice a young person who appears to have attended the demo sitting on the side of the road alone, that should be an E, curled up in the fetal position with their head cradled in their arms. They're rolling in place with their eyes closed and moaning. So if that's a scenario that you feel like I want to be able to step up in, I want to learn how or work through some of the questions around that, choose scenario number 2. And scenario number 3, also very familiar for many of us. You live in a large apartment building and have been sheltering at home with your partner and a grandparent. Your sibling is also in your bubble and has 2 toddlers, one of whom is immunocompromised. You have a polite but distant relationship to your neighbors across the way and have seen a teenager and 2 adults who seem to be living there as a family. It is Sunday around noon. You notice crashing sounds from your neighbor's apartment and a lot of loud banging, yelling, and then silence. You look into the hallway and see your neighbor's back moving quickly away from you and hitting the elevator button. You notice intense crying sounds from inside their apartment. So whichever scenario that you chose, these are the 5 questions, and I'll leave this up so you can reflect as you write. What's your first sign of empathy in this scenario? How did your body show up while you were hearing it or while you were reading it? What are your choices? What factors would you need to consider before choosing a course of action? Who are you most concerned about in this scenario? And what does compassion look like towards yourself and towards others. Okay, Eve is asking me to explain the first sign of empathy. Do you mean what are the first feelings of empathy that come up in that situation? Yeah, that's what I meant. You might feel it in your body, like as a pull. You might feel it as a resistance or some fear. You might even feel intellectually curious. We all have so many different experiences of what empathy looks like. We're realizing that it could be super helpful for folks who want to share or ask a question to have the opportunity to do that before Naty starts their section. So I'm gonna open that now. Katie, please, what would you like to share with the group?
Oh, I just have it all typed out for myself because I was just about to share it in the
chat?
Yeah, in the chat. So I'm just going to read what I wrote.
Excellent.
I think that in scenario 2 at the rally, a form of compassion to myself would be that once I have committed to go over and see if the person is okay, to tell someone I am doing this action. And except for in the blurb, it kind of, I got the impression that I was alone during this scenario, but if I wasn't alone, I would tell someone I was with, hopefully I'd be with someone, that I was going to do this. And then if I wasn't alone, I would tell myself that if I needed to, I would call my sister. And then another form of compassion to myself and others would be to commit to the action of seeing if this person is okay, because it is what my empathy tells me to do, is what I wrote at the end.
That's awesome. There's so many good pieces of wisdom in that, Katie. I love the thoughtfulness of having someone to call and knowing that just asking them if they're okay is actually breaking a huge barrier. So often people experience increased social isolation because if they're in public and in distress, people just ignore them. So I really appreciate what you're bringing up also as coming from just the human impulse to connect. That's really all we need when we're here to support each other. We all have different skills, different awareness, different knowledge, and literally the bottom line is the desire to connect and notice. And calling your sister is a great idea. Thank you. Do you want to maybe put it in the chat so folks can also just gain the wisdom of reading it?
Sure.
Okay, awesome.
Oh, I didn't realize it was still on. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Would others like to share some of their responses to a scenario or a question that they have? I'm looking for hands. And if we don't see hands, that's totally cool as well. Okay, I see Sheba. Hi, Sheba, please. What would you like to share? Hi.
Yeah, I felt that in your what is it? I think the first example where there is sort of a more somebody who is sort of quickly walking towards you. It's late at night. I think this is probably coming from my inexperience that I felt very fearful just by even reading that. So for me, the struggle, like I really tried to force myself to do that one for that reason, just because of my discomfort. And I was realizing that that as much as I would like to in this space acknowledge that my first instinct would be to help somebody who would be in need in that situation, I think I would just I would come from a place of fear for myself and for my neighbor. We're walking at night. So I was just trying to kind of go over it and imagine sort of a scenario that I would be able to do more than just kind of get out of the way. So yeah, just kind of seeing if there was a way to once I'm because I can acknowledge there is a fear there in that person who might be talking to themselves, maybe angrily, maybe walking aggressively, but maybe even though it looks like they're going in my direction, that it might not be me or my neighbor that they're coming for. And maybe it's just sort of frantic walking and they're very angry about something. Maybe their car got stolen or something happened, you know? So maybe it's just getting the sense of immediate danger out of the way and then finding a way to approach them. But I raised my hand because I'm wondering sort of how would you connect with somebody who is in that state, like in a place of where there's an inherent feeling of, you know, being vulnerable at that time of day, and maybe with me and this one other person, and I don't feel like I'm necessarily in a safe situation. Like, how would you sort of approach something like that?
I love that question, and I'm also going to invite your input, Naty, because I think it really speaks to assessment, right? How we take an immediate scenario in front of us and make a decision about it. So this question of fear and its role in our body is so central to abolition, because much of the fear that we experience is rooted in lessons we've learned about what we should be afraid of. However, fear is also rooted in our lived experience of danger. And sometimes these things are very separate and sometimes they're completely linked. And so I think the first piece is always to know that any decision you make is okay, right? And there will be moments like there's someone in the chat, it's now gone, but someone said that they noticed they felt fear, or they'd leave for one scenario, they'd ask for another, and the third they would feel uncomfortable. And for me personally, and I do not say this is right, discomfort is when I'm willing to participate. Full on fear, I'm not.
Right.
And getting used to that and feeling okay with that, I expect will be a lifelong journey for me. So even spending time in meditation or in quiet when we're very resourced, noticing how discomfort shows up versus fear. And that will also shift over time and depending on so many factors in every scenario. So I don't know, that's sort of my thought on it. What do you think, Naty?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for that. Thanks for that kind of that question, that framing up, Shiba. And Orev, I definitely like really, you've made my job so much easier with all this context you've already given. I guess some things that come to mind are immediately like, is this a crisis? Is this a crisis that this person is like, is expressing? Or is it more like a perceived crisis because the way a person is moving through the world doesn't fit with our expectations? And so, and Shiva, you named that, right? Which is like, maybe this person isn't necessarily interested in me at all. And granted, of course, like in that kind of an instance, darkness, depending on your gender, your experiences of violence in the streets, if you're alone, if you're with other people, if you feel any degree of confidence that you could protect yourself, all of those things will inform whether you feel like I can give space to assess what's going on here, or actually I just have to move really quickly and get out of here. And I think that totally is an instance where, you know, you do really have to trust your gut on that, especially I think out in the streets with limited supports and and to be real with people that we don't already have relationship or connection with. I think I would feel completely different about it if it was someone in my neighborhood, someone that I have connection or relationship with, even if I didn't necessarily fully, have a trusting relationship with them. And I definitely have had some experiences, and granted, I'd say I'm read as kind of, I'm not sure how I'm read, to be honest, as in terms of my gender. I think I'm definitely read as a white passing person with some degrees of masculinity, depends on the day, how much sequence I'm wearing. But I definitely, depending on my own reading of a person, like that, all this in terms of assessment, just like really at the end of the day, you just got to trust your gut. And if I was like, okay, I'm feeling confident, I've checked in with my friend in the quickest way possible, and we're just going to make some space to kind of be with this person. And I'll say, like, my approach for a crisis is generally like, how can I be with this? It's not like, how can I help this situation, but is my being with this person or this crisis moment helpful to assess and collect information and maybe move this person into a more grounded place, maybe, or into a safer space, maybe. So in that situation, like, yeah, let's step back, let's get closer together, let's observe, always making sure that there's space between us and this person, and just like reading the cues from this person, and they may just totally go by. And to me, then there's no crisis at all. Granted, I think on an instance somewhat similar to that, where I witnessed a person moving through the streets at night, and I think depending on what neighborhood they're moving through, depending on how heavily policed it is, depending on how they're read by people, there's a crisis again based on how threatening they might present to other people. And so then I might feel like, oh, maybe I should just, I don't know, maybe I should try to talk to that person and make a connection and just, relay, if you set that thing on fire, that might bring some unwarranted attention to you, my friend. And again, if I can be with that person, and maybe witness or maybe like reduce actually the crisis or conflict that other people bring, which is often as much a part of a crisis, especially out in the street, as an internal crisis, I might do that if it feels possible to do that. So I don't know, that's a long-winded answer to name. Like, crisis is a complicated thing to define sometimes. Is it my crisis? Is it the neighborhood's crisis? Is it this person's crisis? Are they actually asking for help? I think I'll offer a pared down piece that kind of, I think, can parallel with all the juicy goodness that Orev has shared. Because I also want to make space for just general questions, and also, like, I love the energy, the intention of this Skillshare. I'm sure, like, with every question that's kind of surfaced, many people in this the digital ethers here have had ideas and thoughts to share. So I definitely want to make sure to give space to that. So I guess just I would say what I would add to all the goodness are just some like quick pieces, so that example that we were just looking at, I think it is a really interesting one because it's an instance where you don't necessarily have tons of time to make all kinds of assessments. So with all of that, I generally would say all of these teachings on being grounded, on just, especially if you're in community regularly, and that's your intention, to be in community, and in community where crisis shows up, where it shows up. And of course, it shows up everywhere. But I would also say low-income communities that are targeted especially by policing and criminalization, communities where many of the bodies and identities are considered dangerous, risky, abnormal, etc., that crisis will show up more. A little tool that I've developed with young people in community spaces where we're holding kind of open space, drop in, if you will, and in particular for low-income and street-involved communities. It's the 4 S's, everybody, the 4 S's. Okay, the 4 S's of assessment. So in a moment where I realize, okay, I can see there's some clear markers that there is a crisis happening right here, and that I'm pretty close to it. I have the potential opportunity to step in and be with this crisis, first thing, self-assessment. If I've done all of that beautiful mapping that Orev has encouraged, if I've already got a web of support, if I'm rested, if my basic needs are met, if I have regular practices of self-care, well, then it's probably a lot easier to do that self-assessment. Yes, that's one piece, but also, what tools do I have at my disposal right now? Literally, do I have any medicines? Do I have any food or water? Do I have a harm reduction kit of supplies? Do I have art materials? Do I have smudge? Depending on the situation, of course. Do I have any of those things? And then I tend to think, if you're in community, I recommend carrying some of those things. Yep, or all of them. Woohoo! It's a bundle. And then, of course, how's my heart? in my toolkit, depending on this situation, do I have the confidence? Do I have the voice? Do I have the courage? All of these things. But this is a quick self-assessment. First, S number 2, spatial assessment. And there's so much in there. And of course, I recognize that this might have to happen really quickly, but what space are you in? Who else is there? When I was talking about, like, is the crisis an individual? Is the crisis exacerbated by how people perceive this crisis? Are you in the street? Are you near traffic? Any potential risks in that space? Making as many assessments as you can. If you're in a closed space, is this person close to entrances or exits? And one might think, oh, you don't want them to flee, but I would say it's better for them to be closer to entrances and exits so they don't feel like they're trapped. Because that is really key. That's I would say a critical tenet of being with someone in crisis is that they can make choices, that they can consent to be there, that they can consent to leave if they need to. Are there things that are potential harms, like sharp objects, but to be honest, I actually personally have never experienced the need to, like, worry about weapons in a crisis. And that makes me think, actually, to that point. So Reach Out Toronto is kind of a new emergence of social workers and community workers who are trying to provide, like, some quick response mental health support specifically for crisis, but I think more long-term as well. And they, on their website, they recently published a website. They have some, I think, really relevant safety facts around mental health first aid. So I'm just going to, like, pause from the 4 S's just to share a few of those pieces. So in, let's see here now, 1 in 25,958 calls, and this is specifically to Toronto, specifically around mental health crisis, 1 in 25,958 resulted in minor injuries, which is to say a staff injured a finger, a client spit on a person or a staff. There have been no deaths or major injuries to frontline workers, clients, or third parties. This has not at least been reported. And this is, again, in the context of Toronto. And in fact, individuals with a mental health illness or crisis are more likely to be victims of violence rather than perpetrators of violence. They also name 84% of 911 calls related to mental health crisis do not involve the presence of any type of weapons. They also name that 89% of 911 calls related to mental health crisis do not involve any harmful behavior towards others. And, that may depend on one's definition of harmful behavior, but if we were to be clear that it's like a violent attack on someone, not just words, that it's very minimal. So those are some relevant statistics to share on the piece around assessing spatial safety. Okay, S number 3, situation assessment. So that, to me, is the deep work of being with a person to understand what's the situation at hand. So what's going on for the person, and that's, like, an easy thing to say, but immediately when you sit with a person, even with, like, all the critical analysis and awareness, bias will show up, judgment will show up. So the ability to be self-aware, to be conscious of the ways that those things show up, the way you might position yourself around trying to drive someone towards making decisions or taking action or coming up with a strategy, that may not necessarily be a useful goal. That, in fact, maybe just being with a person is the most useful thing that you can do. And it's not necessarily that the crisis requires a resolution per se, just to name. So being with, for me, is very much about being conscious of your positionality. Your being with may be short-lived. You might realize that even with my greatest intentions of being with this person, that just my positionality, the way that they read me and perceive me, is triggering as hell. And I can use my most gentle voice or bring whatever resources, and that may still not help. And so to me, that being with is like hyper awareness, hyper sensitivity to all the ways that a person is communicating where they're at, and the overt and also the subtle. And this is totally something Orev has already mentioned. Deep listening. And I generally use a kind of a transformative justice framework when being with people. So, what is happening for you right now? How have you been harmed? How are you being harmed? Has anyone else been impacted? What do you feel is needed to make things right now? It's just right now, just a short-term strategy. So that's a situation assessment. And again, I can't say there's a list of 20 ways if you take this approach, it's going to work. To me, it is like being acutely sensitive to each way that you try to be with the person and ask those questions as gently and as carefully as you can. Having said that, sometimes you might need to be firm, and that requires that deep sensitivity. That requires that deep sensitivity. And again, always being conscious of what risks might come up. So it can be assumed that if you're gentle, that's going to be received really well. And I think that is true, especially if it comes from a place of love, care, and compassion. But sometimes that also can be hella patronizing. So again, it depends on your positionality and what relationships you may or may not have with this person, etc. Additional pieces on, I don't have a beautiful PowerPoint. I just want to name that. I do have a cute list with some like hot pink titles, but I'm not going to share it right now because we're good. I really just wanted to add anything that hasn't been touched on yet. I do think, again, like probably one of the most important things in terms of the way you communicate is just a genuineness. And again, I would say that is so rooted in your ability to be grounded and present and sincere in your intention to be with the person in empathy rather than sympathy, or I'm trying to help them. I can think of instances where when I was able to be with a person for in a couple hours, and I recognize it's not always possible, it's not always appropriate, that just sitting with a person while they were reeling, and then maybe 3 hours through that process, eventually we could have a conversation. And that was being with them in the best way that was possible at that time. And intervening or asking them to stop what they were doing wouldn't have been helpful. And so if using drugs that kind of increased their agitation was what they were doing from a harm reduction place, I would say I could be with this person and try and reduce the impacts on other people. Again, it depends on what your capacity is, how much time you have. That obviously, if you're a social worker and this person is coming to you in a space where you're offering service provision, it may depend on the rules and protocols of that space, because often I think people can feel like I actually can only give maybe 30 minutes to this person because I have a list of 100 other people I need to get with, connect with, support. So I recognize that that's also a pressure in how you can be with a person in that third S, assessing the situation and being with the person. Another piece that I think is so important is not taking anything personally. It's not about you. Even if that person knows you, it's not about you. And I recognize that can be incredibly difficult if a person is directly insulting you, is intentionally trying to insult you. And I do try to tell myself, and I recognize that, I have, just as you named, or I have some degrees of privilege and degrees of, like I think, like if someone was when you asked the question about the web of safety, I was thinking probably transphobia would trigger me enough that I would have a hard time being empathetic. But I think I could cut through it and recognize often when people are really in struggle, they will refer to systems of power to give weight to their the harm that they're trying to cause, or the insults or the cuts that they're trying to make. And again, it's not necessarily about you. It's trying to actually maybe have a feeling of power in a situation, which I think can be relevant when a person is in crisis. What else is it? I think I also really want to say in terms of an assessment of a situation, physicality. So it can be assumed like being close to a person, or like I've been talking with them now, I've built some trust. I could like maybe put my hand on their shoulder, or maybe I could get a little bit closer. Those are, again, like some people that would work really well. Other people, it would be incredibly triggering. I know that this is a given, but for some folks, that can be such a natural part of how we are with people and connect with people. And I generally would say I would recommend not touching people. I would also say never try and grab someone, never try and restrain someone, never try and even put yourself in between a person and another space. Even if I think even if you're a strong person, because one, it's incredibly threatening and it actually generally escalates things. Never grab a person. And I know that that might be a given, but I've seen some wild things. I'm just going to say I've seen some wild things in situations where people should have known better. I do want to say then the fourth S, which you may or may not get to. You may really just be with a person, assessing the situation, and they might be like, okay, I'm ready to leave. And this is in the context of, you know, encountering someone in the street and just being with them and assessing if, for example, the young person who's huddled on the ground, if your empathy is that that person is looks like they're in trouble, I want to know that they're okay. I want them to feel like they're supported. Maybe by being with them, that's conveyed, and you move forward. It's not necessarily about connecting them to some, you know, housing and string of supports and services, although that's always ideal when we can provide that. Just to name, we don't always get to supports and supporting and connecting people to service in an attempt to address mental health crisis. Sometimes it really is just helping someone get their feet back on the ground. Having said that, though, if you get to the fourth S and you're in a place where you realize, okay, this person really does need supports, or at least needs to talk through supports in order to maybe find some of that grounding. Yeah, that again, I feel like, one, don't make any commitments that you can't actually follow through on. Do you have connection to other people that you can call in your assessment of supports? Does this person articulate anyone else in their web of care that might be available to them, or service providers or care workers? Are there services that they are specifically naming that they would like to have access to? Is that something that you can support them with? And generally, I would say really only working on short-term supports. Unless you have a deep relationship with someone and you can actually see through a connection to other supports, I think that it's like most useful to help a person get grounded and start to negotiate basic short-term needs in the heat of a crisis. I would also generally say I tried to use a collaborative approach to understanding and assessing support. Some people, you know, I would say lean heavily into a directive approach, which is like, I think you need this, I think you need that. I think that's pretty much only useful if someone is incapacitated. And perhaps it's like, I think actually we're in a really dangerous space. We're in the street, you're near traffic. I need you to move. I need us to move together. And generally I would say, I need us to move together rather than I need you to move. Otherwise, and I would say also in terms of directive negotiation, if someone is actually being violent, it's really important to express your boundaries and to say, you can't do that. Otherwise, I would generally say applying a collaborative approach wherever possible, or even more ideally, non-directive, which is to say fully supporting their self-determination, which usually requires, again, pushing through our bias that someone in crisis is not able to self-determine or consent to what they need next. It may just take a little bit of time to get there, but I actually truly believe it's possible. And I guess I just like, it's probably already known, a piece I want to name that Orev has already named as well, is that there aren't tons of crisis support resources in the context of Toronto. And there are very few that are not connected to very problematic institutions. As it stands right now, if you call 911 to get mental health crisis mobile unit support, they're connected to the police, and more than likely they will send the police because it's a super understaffed, under-resourced portion of the policing department. Another piece, if you're a family member and you're connected to someone who is in kind of like a chronic state of crisis, and you might be feeling like, I don't know how, like we don't have space for them, we don't have people who have capacity to support them. Maybe the only option is institutionalization. And like I say that with a heavy heart because I've been in that position myself where I've taken someone to KMH because all of our other resources were exhausted. And actually, unless that person was brought by the police, she couldn't be institutionalized, actually. And if she wasn't consenting to be institutionalized, she couldn't be. And, you know, those are like, I think, in some ways useful check-in points, and in other ways, they're incredibly difficult to work with for community members, family members who are really exhausted. What does that point to? Our need within our community, not just to have immediate crisis response, but deeper webs of care. So, you know, beyond what has already been stated, the 4 S's: self-assessment, spatial assessment, situational assessment, and supports assessment. I think already having webs of care for ourselves so that we can talk through, because I recommend anytime you work through a crisis that you definitely check in with people in advance, and you also check in with people after the fact, and you process it with people. This is what happened. This is what I did. What do you think about that? Like what we're doing right now. Because even if I take all the workshops, I'm still not a professional. I'm still going to make mistakes, and those mistakes have impact, but they're also learning points. And I think it's really relevant to share that with other people. I believe it is possible that in the relative future, each and every one of us will have care webs that are interconnected. So we will know who to call when someone's in a crisis. I do want to name, so this, the Reach Out Response Network, they're trying to set up like an 811 call system, if you will, to provide like 24/7 responders for mental health crisis. That's awesome. There's a lot of neighborhood support networks that are emerging. They're neighborhood specific. They generally are like, you know, a WhatsApp thread. They're very informal, but it can be a place if you're like, something's going down on this block right now, and if anyone is able to come down, that would be great. It's an amazing way to organize really quickly, but we totally need more infrastructure around that. And then I'll also say we need a lot more around the kind of preventative and post conflict infrastructure. This is like a shameless plug because I work in transformative justice quite a bit. Would love to see more infrastructure in our communities to support conflicts before they become crises, and to also develop a kind of transformative justice lens for mental health first aid. So not just like, you know, how do I get you to the next supports, but who else is impacted here? What are the roots of this? What is deeper beyond what we're seeing right now, the iceberg above the ocean level? So I'd shout out Rittenhouse, and I'd shout out Peace Pillars, and I'd shout out St. Stephen's Conflict Resolution and Mediation, but that's not tons. That's not tons if you're in need and you need something really quick to call upon. That was a little bit longer than I wanted. There's tons of other resources, and I know that I imagine that we're going to be sharing documents with people post this workshop. And I know that the intention for this whole thing is to create resources that are shareable with community. And much like Orev, I would really love and welcome feedback and input. But more importantly, since we have about 15 minutes left, are there any questions, or are there any skills that people want to share? Because this is intended to also be a skill share. Are there any points, insights, wisdoms that anyone else in this beautiful group of 116 people would like to share?
Yeah, and I'm seeing Denise has a question. Do you work with any child and youth care practitioners? Which you totally do, Naty.
In general, or should I speak to what that has looked like? I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind when I hear that is, yeah, that there are, in general, cool, thanks, Denise. Yes, I actually work with youth a lot. I've been working with shelter, living, and street involved youth for about 15 years. I would definitely say some of the like challenges I think about in terms of supporting crisis with young people is that as a service provider, for sure social workers, I know this is true, that we have obligations actually to report if a person discloses or expresses the risk of harming themselves or other people, or if they express that they are being harmed, or at home, or if they're experiencing any sexual violence or harassment because they're young people or minors, which can really complicate when you're being with someone. I use very open-ended, because people, if they disclose those things, you kind of have to let them know. You have to let them know, and ideally you let them know in advance. If you disclose any of these things, I can't hold confidentiality, or I may have to, depending on where you work and what the policies are around that. Having said that, I've been really lucky, and I work at a place where we have some good strategies where we let folks know in advance what kind of topics might require contacting authorities. And we are lucky we have never had to. California Community-Based Crisis Alternative. Sweet, look at all this good stuff.
Yeah, there was a question from Alex and Nicole. Nicole reposting Alex's question about like Toronto specific resources.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? I think I'm going to read a few so we don't lose them, if that works for you, Naty.
Yep.
So in addition to that, can you give advice on talking to others about contemplating this concept of discomfort versus safety and building that awareness? That's from HF. I feel like people may feel hostile to even considering this as an idea, that they could mistake these issues or that they're worth distinguishing from each other. So I'm guessing that's probably more for me. And if I missed your question and you don't mind reposting that, that would be great. So maybe you could start, Naty, and I'll go next.
Sure. Yeah, I was admittedly trying to figure out how to copy and paste a bunch of Toronto specific resources.
Yeah, or actually I'm rereading it. It just looks for names and links.
Okay.
So Nicole or Alex, oh no, I'm wrong again. Didn't read the full thing. Yes, Toronto. Thank you. Will the list of links be set out? Yeah. Let's.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get that out to everyone. Okay, I'm going to jump into the piece on discomfort versus safety. I would connect that very much to the ongoing work of building like self-awareness and mindfulness, and for sure analyzing where feelings of discomfort or lack of safety come from based on our experiences of privilege, or being sheltered from violence for much of our life, or being sheltered from having to be involved in conflict regularly, versus, you know, experiencing that regularly and where it is actually quite like common and even natural. That's a place that I would start with people. That definitely been working with young people with different experiences of poverty, and some communities that, you know, or young people coming through that, and I'm talking about specifically like drop-in spaces where anyone can come in and get food and resources and do some, you know, cool programming. That conflicts have surfaced many times where folks feel unsafe because, for example, someone's talking really loud or they're using crass language, and they would like name that as violent. And then sitting down and having a bit of a circle together, unpacking, you know, what is the actual risk there? Is that connected to like actual experiences of violence that you've had? Is it connected to being triggered? Or is it a kind of a, yeah, is it connected to actual bias or fragility? Woo, ... Those are some of the things that come to mind, but it would depend on my relationship to a person in terms of talking about discomfort versus safety, and also that person's positionality and identity. Because I would say there are many instances where like, who the heck am I to tell someone that they deserve, that they shouldn't feel unsafe in a certain situation? But what do you think on that, Orev?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really enter it from a somatic place, which I think comes from both being a survivor of familial violence and having a fair degree of white privilege, that I can take this sort of, I've done a lot of work on my own trauma, a lot of therapeutic work. And that work has come from being in meditation with myself, with my inner world, my habits and patterns for covering up my pain, and the ways that for me I learned how to squash my own fear in order to survive in the bigger picture of my family. Now, that's not necessarily how discomfort versus fear shows up for someone who's racialized, for example, or for someone for whom the way their body moves through space is constantly a target. I would say that in myself, it's literally a different energetic dimension, that gives me some permission to move forward, to step into something, versus that feeling of total shutdown, backing off. I'm protective, and I personally go right into my head. So I can feel discomfort in my belly. I can go, okay, this is awkward. And I have a sense of that awkwardness. And even for me, sometimes like I can smell different when I'm feeling awkward. If it's for like a long enough time, I have this like particular body smell. That stuff I just learned from being in it and being safe enough to retreat and notice. For so many of us, fear and discomfort are like one and the same. And one thing I've learned, and I so love the person, I can't remember who it was, who commented on really making the difference that you did, Naty, between intervention and being with. And that's my learning tonight. I'm gonna use that term, being with. I'm very institutionalized in certain ways in the way I talk about this because of my learning and having worked in the prisons. So being with, as uncomfortable, is sacred. Being with as fear is non-consensual. And, you know, I'm in a place where I kind of can tell right away, but I think what it takes is practice and experiment. And there's no doubt that this stuff is risky, that being with is risky. And so that's why it's so important to build our own sense of safety, what we need, what our bottom line is, what our capacity is, who we're with, what their capacities are, you know, so that we can keep taking these risks. We take these risks for each other in the awareness that all of our liberation is bound together and that those risks are taken for us as well. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but the somatic piece is key for me in terms of making my own assessments, HF. So if you have further comments, please do share.
Thank you so much to both of you, from the bottom of my heart, from the bottom of everybody in the chat's heart, and everyone watching. This was a wonderful way to start this week of learning together, to continue this fight of seeing a world not reliant on the same kinds of policing and criminalization and punishment. Yeah, I know that I feel already so much more prepared to be with community and to continue this work. So yeah, this is an invitation to everybody here to continue coming along with us to do this work where you're at, to step with community. We are creating this world together, and I am so excited to live in it. Thank you so much to everybody that helped make this session possible. Please make sure to check out the remaining sessions that we have as a part of the We Keep Each Other Safe project. We have sessions Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Tomorrow's section is on sexual assault survivor and support. Wednesday section is on harm reduction and overdose response. And Thursday section is on suicide intervention. We originally had a section on police observing that we are postponing, but we will definitely be offering, so please look out for that one. If you would like to contribute to this kind of knowledge sharing and skill sharing, please reach out to Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project on all of our social medias, torontoprisoners.rightsproject@gmail.com. We would love to share our platform with you to make sure that this kind of work can continue happening and as many people as possible can participate.